Another shooting hope that 655.
Here we go.
Okay, you guys got it.
I gotta be taller.
Yeah, I know.
Good afternoon. Let me welcome you to today's roundtable. Last month, we had the first of our Science and Policy Perspectives roundtables focused on the scientific impacts of climate change and the actions necessary to confront this threat. Today, we explore the national security implications of climate change. The impacts from a warming planet and changing climate are increasing. Matter of fact, I just read the article where we broke off from Antarctica. Weather events often leave economic devastation in their wake, increasing droughts and water scarcity issues. As part of the tensions in regional hotspots around the world. So rising sea levels have resulted in eroding coastlines in the United States, flooding parts of the U.S. military bases, and threatening the very existence of small island nations in the Pacific. Some that host critical U.S. military installations and advanced technical assets. Our economy, safety, and security are all affected by the scientific reality of climate change. And our military forces must be prepared to confront all realistic threats, even those that do not come in the form of advancing armies or missiles pointed at our shores. Climate change requires military to change its operational posture and force it to make additional investments to protect the vulnerable infrastructure. Rising sea levels may force the military to defend some of its naval bases from increasing floods or abandon them altogether. Rising temperatures, particularly in desert environments, may affect the ability of the military's air assets to operate effectively. Around the world, a warming climate has already endangered human habitats and increased regional tensions. All of these issues brought on by a warming climate present serious challenges for the U.S. national security interests. I look forward to hearing from you and learning more about the issues from my expert panelists today who have extensive experience addressing the national security implications of climate change. I also hope to hear your suggestions and how you believe the U.S. should respond to these escalating risks and expanding threats. Mr. Beyer, I want to thank you for co-hosting this roundtable and thank you for presiding today. I know this is an issue particularly important to you since Virginia and its military bases have already begun to confront the effects of climate change that we will be discussing today. So with that, I'll turn to Mr. Beyer for his opening statement.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson, very much, and thank you so much for your leadership on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and for taking the initiative to organize these series of roundtables. I believe they're important, timely, and address serious issues that we best confine, so I'm very pleased to co-host this roundtable to address with you national security implications of climate change. I don't believe the U.S. military can afford to ignore the potential threat from climate change. I know I'm not alone in this belief that many current and former military experts agree that ignoring the threat of climate change is not a risk worth taking, and that dismissing this reality imperils the national security. They note that the changing climate will have significant negative effects on our military infrastructure and operational readiness, on regional tensions around the world, and on economic ramifications for our military and for the general economy. Sea level rise in my home state of Virginia, we talk about a lot. Norfolk, Newport News, Hampton Roads at large. Military operations are likely to be impeded and military personnel endangered as a result of the accelerating climate-related conditions. So from ice melt in the Arctic to rising sea levels in Annapolis, our national security community has been forced to confront the impacts of a warming world, increasing natural resources shortages, including drinkable water, intensifying natural disasters such as droughts and floods, and increasing waves of migration away from impacted areas are likely to lead to famine, as well as to exacerbate political, religious, cultural, and other tensions around the world. In these and other ways, climate change is a threat multiplier. And many interstate wars, civil wars, and terrorist attacks in the future could all have their roots in the damage caused by climate change. This is not an over-the-top assessment. It's unfortunately a reality that observations from around the world are confirming and that science is eliminating. And it seems to be one that the U.S. military has been preparing for a long time. Despite efforts by some to ignore these risks, the national security community must rely on facts, not ideology, to confront potential threats. We manage risks along so many fields. In business medicine on the battlefield, we know we never have 100% certainty. But when we have high magnitude risk scenarios, we have to pay attention and respond. The national security implications of climate change are significant risks, and we need to address them. In May of this year, the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, told Congress that global warming is, and I quote, projected to fuel more intense and frequent extreme weather events that will be distributed unequally in time and geography. Countries with large populations in coastal areas are particularly vulnerable to tropical weather events and storm surges, especially in Asia and Africa. And he went on to say that potential conflicts over shared water resources between countries like Egypt and Ethiopia are likely to intensify in the coming years. And he noted that last year was the hottest year on record since modern measurements began in 1880. So the science is clear and the security threat is real. And we are very grateful to have you today to first to enlighten us and then to answer the difficult questions we hope to offer. So let me begin by introducing our panelists. Each have long and distinguished careers. And let me just do brief introductions, a small fraction of what I could say with these. So Rear Admiral David Titley is the founding director of the Center for Solutions to Weather and Climate Risk and professor of practice in the Department of Meteorology, professor in the School of International Affairs at Pennsylvania State University. He was the chief operating officer at National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, from 2012 to 2013. He is also the former chief oceanographer for the U.S. Navy, where he served for 32 years. He has a PhD in meteorology from the Naval Postgraduate School and is a fellow of the American Meteorological Society. Rear Admiral Ann C. Phillips is an independent consultant member of the Center for Climate Security's Advisory Board. She led the U.S. Navy Surface Working Group for Task Force Climate Change from 2000 to 2012. From 2014 to 2016, she chaired Old Dominion University's Infrastructure Working Group for the Hampton Roads Sea Level Rise Preparedness and Resilience Intergovernmental Pilot Planning Project, about the longest title I've ever heard. She also served in Guam, Lisbon, Portugal, and helped lead U.S. military relief efforts for Hurricane Sandy. Rear Brigadier General Stephen Cheney, a Marine, is the Chief Executive Officer of the American Security Project and a member of the Department of State's Foreign Affairs Policy Board and the Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board. Brigadier General Cheney has served several years in Okinawa, Japan, has traveled extensively through the Middle East and Asia, and was Commanding General of the Marine Corps Depot in Parris Island, South Carolina. He's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, the Marine Corps Command and Staff College, the National War College, and the University of Southern California. He has over 30 years of experience as a Marine and was the Inspector General of the U.S. Marine Corps. Honorable John Campbell is a Senior Fellow for African Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and the former U.S. Ambassador to Nigeria during the administration of President George W. Bush. Ambassador Campbell is a career Foreign Service officer, has held many senior State Department positions throughout his career, and has written about the impact of climate change on ethnic and religious conflict in Nigeria. Dr. Marcus D. King, PhD, is the John Rankin Associate Professor of International Affairs at George Washington University. Dr. King previously directed studies on security aspects of climate change at the Center for Naval Analyses and held a presidential appointment in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where he represented the U.S. negotiations of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change during the Clinton administration. And finally, Sherry Goodman is a Senior Fellow at Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program and the Polar Initiative. She's a former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, was the CEO and President of the Consortium for Ocean Leadership. She's also helped lead the creation of the Center for Naval Analyses Military Advisory Board and its landmark reports on national security and climate change. She's also a member of the Center for Climate and Security's Advisory Board. We are incredibly blessed and fortunate to have so much talent in one room and so much experience, and I would like Admiral Tipley to start us off by giving us your insights. But by the way, typically in the formal hearings, there's a nice clock that says 5 minutes. We're less formal than that, but it's sort of around 5 minutes.
Sort of around. Okay, sir. So we'll be done certainly before 2200 or so with my statement. All right. Well, thank you, Ranking Member Johnson, Mr. Beyer, Ms. Esty, for the opportunity to present today. This is a privilege to come before you today at this roundtable and discuss this very important topic. Thank you also, Congressman Beyer, for the very kind introduction, and again, thanks for holding this roundtable. In the Navy, we have a saying, just give me the bottom line up front, or the bluff. So here's my bluff for today. The rapid change in climate will have significant impacts on our national security. The climate will continue to change rapidly for the remainder of the 21st century and likely beyond. The days of climate stability that we have experienced for much of human civilization are over. Climate change impacts our security in three ways: by changing the physical environment in which our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines will operate. The Arctic is an example of an operational environment that is changing rapidly today. By posing risks to the Department of Defense bases and training range. In addition to sea level rise threatening our coastal installations, other bases and training ranges are at risk from an increased frequency and severity of wildfires, droughts, and floods. And finally, making unstable situations worse, sometimes catastrophically so. Climate change can be a powerful link in a chain of events that, if not broken, can lead to runaway instability. Secondly, we know how to succeed even when the future is not perfectly known. Traditional risk planning takes the chance or probability of an event and multiplies it by impact. But even when it is difficult to assess the likelihood of a specific event, there are still available methods by which risk planning and mitigation can be accomplished. Our national security teams frequently have to account for these deep uncertainties and have a variety of tools to assist them. We can apply these methods and adapt them to the climate change challenge. The Department of Defense has taken the issue of climate change and national security seriously for over a decade. The security establishment does not view this as a partisan or backdoor argument to advocate for specific national policies or programs. This is fundamentally an issue about the future readiness of our armed forces. Our forces must be prepared to operate in a rapidly changing Arctic with decreasing sea ice, increasing human activity, and an ascendant Russia. While the Russians maintain their military buildup in the high north is peaceful and for defensive purposes only, it is impossible to ignore the aggressive operations of Russian forces in that part of the world. A rapidly changing climate may create, accelerate, and exacerbate already unstable situations throughout the world. These impacts can come in the form of food shortages, extreme drought, and forced and unmanaged migration, making hundreds of thousands of people de facto climate refugees. Good governance, early intervention, and proactive diplomacy led by our Department of State and USAID, with the Department of Defense in a supporting role, can be effective mechanisms to manage this instability. Here are two recommendations I have. Adjust policies today for what we know and for what we might reasonably expect in the coming decades. We learned in the military a long time ago that hope by itself is rarely a good strategy. Addressing rapid climate change will be an exercise in risk management for the foreseeable future. The Department of Defense, along with many others, has leveraged the investments authorized by this committee in basic and applied climate science to better understand the parameters of the future risks it faces. The research conducted by NOAA, NASA, and the National Science Foundation is part of the fabric of our overall security structure. The U.S. science and research agencies require adequate resourcing and support by our nation. In closing, I wish to thank the House and specifically the Armed Services Committee for the addition of a forward-thinking climate-related amendment in this year's markup language for the National Defense Authorization Act. I guess we'll find out in a few hours if it's part of the final House bill there. But it is very helpful to have congressional language and intent that encourages the Department of Defense to think in a proactive manner when managing climate risks. Thank you, sirs and ma'ams, very much for your time and attention. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Admiral, very much. Admiral Phillips, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Congressman Beyer. Good afternoon. Thank you to Ranking Member Johnson, Mr. Beyer, Ms. Esty, for hosting this roundtable and for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm honored to be here and to be a part of such a distinguished panel. Congressman Beyer, thank you also for your most kind introduction. I'm a surface warfare officer. I drove ships for 31 years. And I, like my military peers, some of whom are here today, and on active duty around the globe, are operators. I am an operator. I am trained to view a mission in strategic, operational, and tactical terms, to do what is required with clear-eyed, pragmatic focus to prepare and execute a mission. My views today are my own. I believe climate change has a significant and intensifying risk and global instability. This is a real threat, not a political response. Second, the defense community as warfighters have an inherent responsibility to prepare to execute mission. That preparation drives provision, serious provision, for climate change. Mission execution based on engineering and scientific fact, using data from the full range of federal science agencies and academia, placed alongside stated requirements and operational plans. That mission execution includes developing coastal resilience. Finally, climate change adaptation requires a whole of government and community approach, and the defense community needs unrestricted ability to plan, evaluate risk, prepare and implement to projected future circumstances, to execute its mission across government, and also to collaborate both inside and outside the fence line at the state, regional, and local level where necessary. Climate change complicates our military's actions across the globe and our ability to train, our logistics, and our ability to operate. The challenge is particularly acute at coastal military installations, and nowhere more so than Hampton Roads, where I live, a region on the front lines of climate impact. In Hampton Roads, we're experiencing sea level rise at twice the rate of other East Coast locations because we have both sea level rise and subsidence occurring at the same time. We're second only to New Orleans in the rate of change. 18 inches since 1930, roughly 0.2 inches per year. This poses a serious and growing threat to regional military readiness, operations, and strategy. There are 29 separate federal entities represented in the region, spread across nearly 100 distinct facilities, including 16 major bases. Of these, the largest percentage, nearly 2/3, are Department of Defense facilities. Of them, 3/4 are Navy. These facilities include unique national assets: Naval Station Norfolk, arguably the largest naval station in the world; Newport News Naval Shipyard, our only aircraft construction and refueling facility, and one of only 2 submarine construction facilities. In addition, the Air Force's Combat Air Command, the Army's Training and Doctrine Command, a substantial part of Special Operations Forces and training facilities, NATO's Supreme Allied Command for Transformation, the largest NATO base outside of Europe, Coast Guard's Atlantic Area Commander in 5th District, Jefferson Labs, NASA Langley, the 4th largest commercial port on the East Coast. You get the picture. Most of these facilities cannot easily go elsewhere. Not only does this impact military and federal facilities, but sea level rise and climate impact the entire civilian community and diaspora who live and work in the region. The region includes 17 cities and municipalities across nearly 2,900 square miles of territory, 825 miles of coastline. 1.7 million people live in the region. 65% of them travel to another city to work. So resilience and adaptation planning cannot be done in isolation by any DoD facility or by any city or other entity. In my ongoing work in the region, I often have occasion to share experiences with the people I encounter about how they've adapted to cope with climate change. A NATO officer and his wife, realizing they had to buy a 4-wheel drive vehicle when they arrived in the region because they couldn't get out of their neighborhood some of the time without one. A colleague in Virginia Beach who decides what route to take to work, what vehicle to use, and what time to go to work on a military facility based on the high tide cycle, rain prediction, and wind direction. A retired military couple who openly talk of eventually abandoning their home in a prosperous Norfolk neighborhood because they know it will have no market value due to the constant flooding that today blocks their access in and out, even though the actual water level does not impact their property directly. These flooding events also include Naval Station Norfolk, flooding older piers, closing roadways, impacting base operations, and Joint Base Langley Eustis, whose runway floods routinely, and who has developed a predictive software in conjunction with NASA Langley, with whom they share a fence line, that helps them prepare in advance, based on the weather conditions, for what buildings must be guarded, prepared, sandbagged, if you will, so that they don't have additional flood damage. They've also taken the precaution of moving everything out of their below ground level buildings, and out of, in many cases, partially submerged first floors, so that they don't have any actual business or functioning utilities in those areas, so that they reduce the cost every time they have a flooding incident. In discussing the national security implications of climate change, the Hampton Roads region is a crucible, the entire range of challenges. Between the large number of federal and DoD facilities and the Port of Virginia, the fact that we're dealing with water in places we don't want or expect it on an ever more routine basis, we have nearly every climate-related challenge in our future. In closing, the defense community is serious about its responsibilities, and in considering recommended actions, I would offer legislation that supports the ability to plan, interact, share, use the latest data from NOAA, NASA, Geological Survey, and to develop shared funding and financing strategies in an open manner between federal, state, and local government authorities will definitely help prepare this region for future climate impacts. I too applaud the actions of the members of the House Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus and those who are signatories of House Resolution 195, and the actions of the House and Senate for their forward-thinking climate-related language in the current markup for the National Defense Authorization Act. All of this supports the defense community as it works to prepare for global climate impact. How this remains to be resolved through conference, we will see, but it's heartening to see it be considered. Finally, we must ensure we allow the defense community to do its job at home and abroad, and to facilitate our ability to plan and prepare as a nation to execute our national security strategy. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm happy to take your questions.
Admiral, thank you very much. And thank you for talking so much about Virginia. I'd also like to introduce Congressman Jimmy Panetta. who's in the front row there, another important member of the U.S. Congress. You may recognize the name. His father has something to do with defense and intelligence and years past. So, and Jimmy, if we get to questions and you're here, we keep on that. Jim, you're also a member of the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Conference.
Correct. Yeah,
Good
meeting yesterday.
Yeah, as am I, and Elizabeth would be, but
That's my different public.
yeah. It's an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. So if a Democrat wants to join, you've got to find a Republican to with us. Which is the perfect intro for Steve Cheney, who, as head of American Security Project, has the coolest logo of bipartisanship. It's the red to blue or blue to red spectrum, indicating that we have to do these things together. General Cheney, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Ranking Member Johnson and my congressman and neighbor, Don Beyer, thank you for hosting the roundtable and asking me to participate. I, like the others, have submitted a written statement for the record, so I'll try to keep my remarks a little bit brief. The American Security Project was founded in 2005 as a bipartisan initiative to tackle long-term challenges from a national security perspective, not encumbered by political bias. Our focus issues range from non-proliferation to counterterrorism, American competitiveness to energy security. Our founders, whom you all know, Senators Kerry, Hagel, Hart, and Rudman, asked a host of retired generals and admirals to join ASP, and their only interest was the security of our country, all of whom had spent years defending our country and planning for contingencies. Not to school everybody here, because you all know it, but the mission of the Department of Defense is simple and it's straightforward. It is to provide the military forces needed to deter war and to protect the security of our country. Implicit in that mission is that our military needs to be prepared for every threat. Unfortunately, a changing climate adds to those threats. The national security community, including both our Department of Defense and the intelligence community, have labeled climate change a threat multiplier or an accelerant to instability. Further, we can break the threats into what I call strategic threats, meaning that many of the conflicts we see today have been either induced or exacerbated by climate change. At the other end of the spectrum are what I call tactical threats, where climate change directly impacts our military's ability to perform its mission or forces our military to respond. Examples will include rising sea levels that affect our coastal bases and stations, to catastrophic weather that not only impacts our bases and stations, but it impacts our citizens and humanity worldwide. Superstorm Sandy and Typhoon Haiyan are but two prominent examples. On the strategic side, we can shoulder climate change, specifically a drought made deeper and longer because of man-made climate change, provided some of the fuel that ignited the Arab Spring and exacerbated the Syria crisis. So I'm going to dig further into one specific conflict, and pardon my pun here, that sprung from Arab Spring, and that's Mali. In late 2012, the Tuaregs, a traditionally nomadic tribe based in the dry northern section, rose up against the government after 2 years of deep drought. When combined with already existing threats like radical Islam and a surge of new weapons from the civil war in neighboring Libya, the region was just ripe for revolt. The French provided the fighting force that successfully put down the revolt in conjunction with the African Union forces, but it was the U.S. military that provided the key logistic support. The French continue to have 1,600 soldiers in Mali's north today to enforce peace. We should all be very concerned that similar conflicts across the Sahel region in Africa could erupt. Already a source of great migration in the region is one of the world's most vulnerable to climate change, as drought and food insecurity have always threatened the area. It is not an exaggeration to say that there is the potential for millions of climate refugees over the next few decades as droughts drive people out. There are similar hotspots around the world, poster child probably being Bangladesh, for one which faces an unprecedented crisis with sea level rise, causing upward of 30 million more refugees over the next few decades. Going to the tactical side, all of our bases and stations that are in coastal plains are threatened. Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, the Marine depots at Paris Island in San Diego, the Naval Base at Diego Garcia. Perhaps the only good news here is that DoD is well aware of these threats and trying to plan around them. But money and and time are in short supply. They are adapted, and I too commend the House Armed Services Committee for passing an amendment saying that climate change is a direct threat to our national security of the United States, and that military installations must be able to effectively prepare to mitigate climate change. Congress should ensure that language remains in the final version of the NDAA. I suppose we'll find out maybe today. Ultimately, though, the solution here is mitigation, meaning to stop what is causing climate change, which simply is CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere. And there are lots of solutions out there for that as well. I will not detail them right now, but we can discuss it in the Q&A. I look forward to your questions, and thank you again.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Ambassador Campbell, the floor is yours, and certainly with your Nigerian experience, don't shame yourself just talking about what's happening in Africa. We're looking forward to your testimony.
Thank you very much. And my thanks to Congresswoman Johnson and to you, sir. You were also my congressman. And it is an honor to be able to talk about climate change in Nigeria. I too have submitted a statement for the record, and so I will try to be as brief as possible. My central argument is that the United States has to be concerned about the security of its close allies and partners. And what I would like to do this afternoon is call attention to the threat posed to one of our closest partners, perhaps our closest partner in Africa, Nigeria. The challenges posed by climate change there. Nigeria is huge. Population is now considerably larger than that of the Russian Federation. It's doubling every 20 years. The expectation is that by mid-century, it will have displaced the United States as the third largest country in the world by population. The Nigerian state, right now, faces three major challenges, all of which are related to climate change. The first is the Boko Haram insurrection in the northeast, a direct consequence of desertification and drought. Over the past 5 years, rainfall in northern Nigeria has been down by almost 20%. The Sahara is advancing really quite rapidly. What does that do? It promotes impoverishment of a population, which makes it more open to radical influences. It also drives a population of essentially cattle herders towards the south. What happens then? They collide with farmers. The cattle herders are almost all Muslim. The farmers are almost all Christian. The cattle herders are mostly Fulani. The farmers are a variety of different ethnic groups. So all the boundaries line up: ethnicity, religion, and land use. And the result is conflict. And in fact, in the middle belt of Nigeria, as we speak, more people are being killed every day in ostensibly ethnic and religious conflict than are dying in the northeast because of Boko Haram. Okay, if there is too little water in northern Nigeria, there is too much water in the Gulf of Guinea. The result is a pattern of catastrophic floods, the most recent one being in 2012, which led to dramatic cuts in Nigeria's vital oil production, internally displaced millions of people, and perhaps even more sadly, exposed the inability of the Nigerian government to respond to major humanitarian crises caused by natural events. We're talking about a sovereign country. What can we do? What can we do to help? The most important thing is continued engagement with the Nigerian government and with Nigerian civil society on issues related to climate change. And that includes sharing information. What is the means to do that? Civil society, certainly, yes. But also, most importantly, the U.S. Department of State and USAID. These are the two agencies that are the vehicle for that kind of engagement. That makes it essential, in my view, that our diplomatic facilities in Nigeria be maintained and, in fact, enhanced to meet these new challenges. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Ambassador, thank you very much. Fascinating. Dr. King, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Ranking Member Johnson, Mr. Beyer, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. Over the past 15 years, my academic research and publications have sought to better explain linkages between environmental scarcity, specifically in the form of drought, and security threats generated by violent non-state actors. This research includes analysis of natural resource scarcity both as a driver of social and political instability and as an intervening element in various stages of conflict. So first, I'd like to point out that there's an increasing body of academic and policy research identifying clear pathways of influence between climate change impacts and political instability. Instability can lead to outbreaks of large-scale violence or create havens for terrorist and criminal activity in countries important to U.S. national security. In these countries, the results of climate change will manifest across various social, economic, and security sectors, and experts have estimated that harms will far exceed any benefits. Climate change does not act alone. It's connected to stressors, such as food insecurity, water scarcity, and demographic shifts. These stressors are prevalent in unstable, conflict-prone, and strategically significant regions. Water stress caused by droughts, in particular, is a growing global concern. Climate change has been linked to increasing frequency and severity of droughts, particularly in the Middle East and Africa. Water stress has tangible and immediate effects on vulnerable populations. To use another case study, the events that unfolded in Syria in the build-up to the civil war are an instructive example of climate change as an instability accelerant. In 2011, Syria was struck by the worst drought in instrumental record. This drought caused serious losses in wheat crop yields, while prices spiked on global markets based on environmental conditions in Russia. The drought's depletion of Syrian harvests, compounded by historically poor governance of water resources, in turn sparked a wave of migration. Many of migrants were farmers who were forced to move to the cities in northern Syria. Some were relegated to the periphery of shanty towns on the outskirts of settlements where municipal services were scant or non-existent. The violent protests that resulted and harsh repression that became the rallying cry for the uprising against Bashar al-Assad occurred in one such town called Daraa. Thus, climate change was one step on a path of influence leading to the outbreak of conflict, while regional climate forecasts project more severe impacts in the next 2 decades. Egypt is an emerging example where climate conditions are beginning to threaten food security, but perhaps the worst impacts can still be avoided. The expansion of deserts, flooding, and rising tidal flows create great stress to domestic agriculture in the very confined fertile lands of the Nile riverbanks and delta. As the world's leading wheat importer, Egypt's vulnerability to price shocks also led to food riots that preceded the Arab Spring uprisings. It's questionable now whether the government of Egypt has the data or the methods to understand climate change impacts on food security or the institutional capacity to forestall these impacts. Renewed instability in Egypt carries implications for regional and international security. An example closer to the United States, low levels of rural development, environmental degradation, and reliance on climate-sensitive crops have deepened food insecurity in much of Central America. Climate forecasts project an increase in rainfall intensity and the number of days that are dry with higher temperatures. These factors are multiplying existing risks of droughts and floods in Guatemala. Guatemala has historically been highly exposed and unable to cope with such recurring disasters. Weak government responses have eroded state legitimacy, creating ungoverned spaces. And again, rural to urban migration has exposed Guatemalan youth to recruitment by criminal gangs, transnational narcotics, and trafficking cartels. In 2014, 17,000 unaccompanied minors from Guatemala were detained at the US-Mexican border, fleeing poverty, gang recruitment, and this violence. So given the unprecedented changes to climate that are underway, the historical record does not provide sufficient evidence to develop reliable future scenarios of instability. Future simulations, foresight exercises, and other research that enables a more nuanced understanding of interconnections between climate, demographic pressure, and state stability are increasingly important to U.S. national security organizations. Support for collaboration between U.S. scientific research and national security organizations is an essential factor in building reliable assessments. Last year, the U.S. National Intelligence Council produced an assessment at President Obama's request, finding that climate change will likely pose wide-ranging national security challenges for the United States over the next 2 decades. Evidence-based research and analysis relies on a foundation of basic climate science supported by U.S. civilian agencies such as NASA, NOAA, NSF, and also the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Current intelligence estimates are based on scenarios that will unfold in the next 2 or 3 decades. Regrettably, the results of the most aggressive mitigation policies will not substantially reverse acceleration of climate change within this time frame. Therefore, the U.S. government must act today by investing capacity to predict likely flashpoints of violent conflict and make some interventions that avoid the worst outcomes for national security. Thank you once again for the opportunity to offer this statement, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. King, very much. And last but certainly not least, who's going to the floor is yours. But by the way, Sherry, before you start, I'd like to also welcome to the panel distinguished Congresswoman Colleen Hanabusa from Hawaii. We'll see how climate change affects Hawaii. And our wonderful Congresswoman from Southern California, Ned Barragán. Thank you both for joining us. Sherry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Beyer, and thank you, Ranking Member Johnson, and thank you, members of the committee, for having this panel and roundtable today. I'm, along with my colleagues, very pleased to be here with you. You know, the environment, specifically weather, has played a role in military planning from Trenton to D-Day to the raid to get Osama bin Laden. And as you heard earlier from Admiral Phillips, it plays a role today even in peacetime operations in flooded regions of our country. 10 years ago, I founded the CNA Military Advisory Board, organizing a dozen of our nation's leading retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals to look specifically at the national security implications of climate change. I believe that there were going to be, and indeed are, national security implications to climate change. We were the first security organization to recognize and clearly identify climate change as a threat multiplier, a phrase I personally coined. Our work was informed by the science conducted and supported by key U.S. agencies that this committee oversees, the National Science Foundation, NOAA, NASA, and many others. 3 years ago, the retired generals and admirals at CNA re-examined this issue and concluded that climate change is now a catalyst for conflict and an accelerating risk. I've subsequently focused my attention on the security risks of climate change as manifest by the impacts on water, the oceans, and the Arctic. And I'll talk about each of those a little bit today. As is clear from the panelists here today, when it comes to thinking about the impacts of climate change, we must guard against a failure of imagination. As the world's population and living standards continue to grow, the projected climate impacts on the nexus of water, food, and energy security become more profound. Fresh water, food, and energy are inextricably linked, and choices concerning how these finite resources will be produced, distributed, and used will have increasing security implications. From Egypt to Syria to Pakistan, and as we just heard in Nigeria, These strategically critical, fragile, and failing states are all the more at risk due to climate disruption. But U.S. homeland and economic security are also directly affected by climate impacts. Our military, as we've heard, climate change is detrimental to military readiness. It strains base resilience at home, from Norfolk to California, and may limit our ability to respond to future demands. Given the forward presence of our military around the world, there will be increased demand for the military to provide humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, both at home and abroad. Our infrastructure. The impacts of climate change can be detrimental to the physical components of our national critical infrastructure while also limiting their capacity. Our infrastructure protection planning documents should have more explicit planning scenarios. Let me turn now to the Arctic. In 2012, the level of ice coverage in the Arctic was the lowest on record by more than 1 million square miles. 2017 is on pace to beat that record, unfortunately. While annual figures vary, the overall trend is clearly toward less ice coverage. The United States and the international community are not prepared for the pace of change in the Arctic. The Arctic is rich in resources, and less ice will mean that valuable resources and shorter transit routes will be increasingly accessible. This brings opportunity but also risk in likely accidents or oil spills. Further, China is increasing its investment in Greenland and Iceland to secure rare earth minerals and other resources it needs to feed its growing economy and population. Not to mention Russia's military buildup in the Arctic and elsewhere, whose intentions are not entirely clear. The Woodrow Wilson International Center's Polar Initiative has devoted increasing attention to this critical region. And many of your colleagues, and we hope you will be participants in this effort with us. But it is the oceans that may have the largest impact on society. And here I have to tip my hat to Congressman Panetta, who maybe left the room, but his father, Leon, Secretary Panetta, with whom I have the privilege of serving on the Joint Ocean Commission Initiative, has been a very strong leader in this area, both when he was Secretary of Defense and in the intelligence community and elsewhere. Just as it did millions of years ago, as the temperature of the oceans increases, it will expand and sea levels are rising. Add to that melting glaciers and the ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica, as we've heard. Another large piece has already broken off. We can see anywhere from 1 meter to 3 or more meters over the next 80 years. This will swallow low-lying islands in the Pacific, but as importantly, it will impact billions of people who live near the coast and in the world's mega cities. A good portion of Florida could be underwater or have saltwater intrusion, and it will also impact the Mekong Delta, the breadbasket of Asia, and the fertile Nile Delta, and countless other areas around the world. 16 of the 20 most populated urban areas in the world are on the coast, many in Asia. We have already seen the results of climate-induced migration in Syria, as has earlier been discussed. The future will bring more climate-induced migration. We are already experiencing climate-induced migration both in our own country, in Alaska and Louisiana, where communities are being relocated even as we speak. What can Congress do? Support funding for the science agencies that this committee oversees, NOAA, NASA, and NSF, in areas that enable better understanding of changing climate dynamics and Earth system prediction. We are on the cusp now, as we were 25 years ago when we made critical advances in weather to be able to better predict weather over the 7-day time period we now have. We are on the cusp of Earth system prediction in the science community that will enable us to have better predictive capability for global climate change at regional and local scales that we haven't yet had. That Earth system prediction is critical both for military planning and for civilian planning. Second, make infrastructure investments that protect coastal communities, take action to support sustainable economic development in the Arctic, and finally, continue to support the work of DoD and other federal agencies responsibly to prepare and adapt to the impacts of climate change. I also wish to thank the House and the Senate for adding the climate security amendments to the markup of the defense authorization bills this year. The broad bipartisan support is critical to continued support for this work across the whole of government. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. You could fill an entire issue of Foreign Affairs magazine with the one. So greatly appreciated. I want to emphasize this is going to be an informal structural index card, which are available back there, and our Science, Space, Technology Committee staff will be collecting. And we will try to intersperse them along the way. Well, let's begin with our ranking member of the Science, Space, Technology Committee, Ms. Johnson, for questions.
Thank you very much. You know, we are facing quite a bit of reduction in investments. Of course, defense is one of the ones that's not being reduced as much. But with what we're facing, we really need to understand more clearly what the implications really are. We have a lot of sophisticated sensors in our satellites that often are negatively affected by age and not having the funds to replace. But that's the only way we have of monitoring our environment. We feel very confident with the attention that's given to defense that our armed forces are probably going to be okay. But what is it that we need to be noticing beyond that? What is important for us to be aware of as we plan for our defense? You've pointed out a number of incidences. I'm not sure that more than 10 or 15 people in this Congress would recognize that the environment would have any implications there. We have a great job to attempt to educate, but while we're educating, we also have a responsibility of making sure that we remain safe. So if you could point out some of the things, some of the directions you think we need to be going, and some of the make it not so obvious to persons who are not looking on a daily basis as to the implications of climate change. The reason we really know about it is because we have sensors that help us to predict. We feel it, but even with all that, we still have a lot of denying. So if anybody can comment on that, I would appreciate it.
Well, several years ago, our commander of the Pacific Forces, Admiral Locklear, observed in congressional testimony that climate change is among the greatest threats that he faced in the Asia-Pacific region. And that undoubtedly is still true, if not more so today, given the risks of increasing extreme weather events in highly populated and dense regions and low-lying regions of that area. The satellites, sensors, other science support throughout federal and military agencies is key better to understanding those risks and being able to reduce them. As you noted, Congresswoman, the U.S. has always been at the leading edge of technological developments. We shouldn't lose our edge in this area right now. We have the ability to lean forward with Earth system prediction that will enable advances both in our own military weather and climate planning efforts, but also will help civilian society. Yes.
Thanks, Congresswoman. I think I'm going to approach it just slightly different than Sherry. I agree with everything that she said there. When you look at the things that this committee especially does, that long-term ability to monitor climate cannot be understated. Because once you start breaking those records, yes, you can get smart people to try to put together different records, but then you're just adding uncertainty. And we know that one of the ways to reduce the uncertainty is longer and longer times. But if you keep breaking them up, you keep sort of starting at the beginning again. It's like trying to get up a metro escalator or something. It never works. Things that I think are critical for understanding the climate in general is the rate and magnitude of the sea level rise. I think much of the science community understands this is happening probably a good deal faster than what the UN panel on climate change had. They're still pretty conservative. I think it's at least a meter, maybe a meter and a half this century. I'm not sure I quite see 3. 3 meters means 35 millimeters per year, and right now we're 3.2 millimeters per year. So you got to put a lot of ice into it, 3. But still, 1 meter is very, very significant. And understanding that rate is one of the great unknowns in science right now. Abrupt surprises. The National Academy of Science, about 3 years ago, funded a study called Abrupt Changes or Surprises in Climate. And it's pretty good, but I would recommend that periodically, maybe every 5 years or so, that study is updated. And this committee could be helpful in helping focus either National Science Foundation or the mission agencies into making sure that we're really keeping our eye on things that we see as an increasing risk that maybe we weren't thinking about 5 or 10 years ago in the climate, like the so-called blue blob off of Greenland. As all the ice melts off of Greenland, it tends to really change the ocean circulation. How does that change conditions in the US for the Department of Defense? How does it change conditions in Europe? How does it change rainfall patterns? All the things this panel has talked about. And Sherry alluded to it. There is a program that actually I started in the Department of Defense called Earth System Prediction Capability. In my written statement, I talked about how your committee was very useful in the Weather Research and Improvement Forecast Act to basically direct NOAA to cooperate with the Department of Defense on Earth System Prediction Capability. ESPC, as I call it, is specifically designed to work near-term forecasts between like today and out to about 30 years. While we do want to look at long-term, the issue is not too many people budget for the year 2150, but the Department of Defense, they think about 30 years or so, 30-year shipbuilding, 30-year aircraft, any big infrastructure things. So the more we can help with fidelity and accuracy, both in time and space on those scales, is useful. I'm sure your panel recently with Dr. Sander and other very distinguished members tells you that's a hard thing to do, but that's what science is about, right? Answering the hard questions. So my recommendation then is that could be a focus area if you decided to focus on specific aspects of climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
Congresswoman, you made reference to the fact that the percentage of people presently serving in the Congress with an understanding of the relationship between climate change and security is relatively small. In the parts of the world that I deal with, there's almost no understanding whatsoever. There is virtually no public debate about climate change in Nigeria. Lagos, Nigeria has a population of at least 22 million people, most of whom, many of whom, actually live below sea level. The same phenomena that has been discussed in Hampton Roads, Newport News, New Orleans, Dhaka, also obtains in southern Nigeria. I would suggest that in carrying out our educational function, a way to grab attention is not to talk about abstractions, but rather to talk about the specific impact of climate change on a particular place. So that in the case of Nigeria, for example, the discussion would be how fast the sea levels are rising around Lagos and what the impact is going to be on those 22 million people who live there. That people can relate to. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, one other question that might seem a little offbeat. What are the implications for preparation for our troops? How will the training be modified as we know we're entering into a lot warmer climates?
Congressman, when you talk to the active duty troops, especially at the junior level, they're concerned about what's happening over the next hill and what's the next threat, and what's ISIS, North Korea, China going to do, and they're not thinking 20, 30, 40 years down the pike in terms of climate change and the impact on the DoD's mission. But the more senior ones clearly understand the long-term impact of climate change and where it's going to impact our strategy and bases and stations. As I mentioned before, I break it into tactical and strategic. And on the strategic side, our planners, the J5s from all the combatant commands, the Chairman of Joint Chiefs, J5 planners, have to look 15, 20, 30 years down and see where there's going to be massive migration, especially in the Sahel in Africa, as I mentioned earlier. The potential exists there to have tens of millions leaving that area, and they're not going to go to South Africa. They're going to head north to Europe. And if Europe thinks it's got a migration problem now, just wait 20 or 30 years from now and see what's going on. And for those who put their head in the sand and think that's a European problem, it's not a problem here. An instant breeding ground for terrorists, for ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram. I mean, it just feeds that instability, which is just going to get worse. So I think on the planning side of the house and DoD, the long term, and Sherry mentioned Admiral Locklear, that's what he was looking at. He said, long term, this is going to cause huge problems in his area of operations in the Pacific Command. Well, it's not just going to be the Pacific Command, it's going to be in Central Command, it'll be in Africa Command, it'll be European Command. It will be all over the place. And then on the tactical side, of course, our bases and stations. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist or a scientist, Admiral Tiddley, to look and see what's happening in the bases and stations. As Admiral Phillips pointed out, you can't even drive to work multiple times a year at Norfolk Naval Station. Eglin Air Force Base, same way. This is just a much more frequent occurrence. When I was the commanding general at Paris Island, we evacuated because of the threat of a Hurricane 5, Category 5 hurricane in 1999, which hadn't happened in 40 years. Well, it's happened twice since. These are just going to become routine occurrences that the DoD has to look at, and for those cases, adapt to those.
Thank you very much. Well, additionally, current Secretary of Defense Mattis has already observed that climate change is impacting our forces where they are operating today. So he already sees that impact. It's affecting the stability of our regions where our forces are operating today. It's affecting our ability to train and prepare from Norfolk, in regions like Norfolk, from sea level rise to bases out west where there's not enough water, too much heat, many more black flag days now, meaning high heat days where training is limited to protect the health of the troops, and water availability at our western bases. Right now, there are bases even in Oklahoma that are looking to buy water rights in the region to ensure that they can have water in the future. And this is going to be a continuing pattern. So it's affecting us both readiness, training, and infrastructure today at home and abroad. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, thank you very much for doing this. We've been joined in the meantime by Congressman Bobby Scott, who's the ranking member on the Education Workforce Committee, and I believe a long time ago in his youth was on the Science Committee. And Suzanne Bonamici, who is also a distinguished member of the Science Committee from Portland, Oregon, and the founder of the STEAM Caucus. And also I said that Congresswoman Barragan and Hannah Busa are both part of our Natural Resources Committee. And another Science Committee member now, also Congressman Tom Hill from Albany. So filling up. But because we have so many people eager to talk, we're going to, instead of doing with the 5 minute, we're going to go one question at a time. And we get a couple rounds, we get a couple rounds. So Elizabeth, Ms. Esty, to you.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you for joining us here today. I'm going to ask somewhat of a broader question. And that is, how do we change the dynamics so this becomes not a political issue? Now, you folks are all very involved in the national security and military community, which tends to be conservative by nature and rule-bound and fact-bound, and has been tracking this issue for decades. And yet somehow it has become football here and not in a good way. So I'm trying to ask you to put your motivational hats on a little bit. If you have advice for us, and also dealing with the reality that people are more sensitive to loss than to gain in some ways. We know that from behavioral economics, that people are afraid of losing things that they have. And we also see U.S. leadership in the world an opportunity to sell technologies and adaptation elsewhere. So I'm trying to put these all things, we all sit up here all the time and try to figure out how we can convince our colleagues to take steps that we think are going to be smart and safe and better for America and better for all, everyone who inhabits this planet. So do you have broader counsel for us as we watch how this has developed in a really bad way, that it's not helpful for our nation's security, more for the planet? Just a small question.
I'll go jump on that hand grenade. I'm probably the last person you would want to actually ask advice for on how to do your job, sirs and ma'ams. But from what I've seen, just kind of observing this for quite a few years, is science has become this proxy. We fight about the science because as long as you're having some kind of discussion about the science, you're not talking about the actual issues. And if you don't want to talk about the actual issues, it's perfect. And the scientists, by and large, and I'm kind of one of them, I work at R1 University, Mike Vann is 3 doors down from me. We love to answer questions. So I tell people that, the scientist is kind of like the Labrador Retriever, and the folks who don't really want to do this are like the people throwing the ball with that thing, and we go chase questions, and you can do that a lot of time, and honestly, it's a lot easier to throw the ball than it is to retrieve it. So we need to, I kind of tell people if they have real, actual questions, that's fine, I'll go and answer them. But you can figure out pretty quickly when somebody is, and it's like, hey, you're not Newton, you're not Einstein, you're not Galileo, you're some dude, it's always a dude, in your mom's garage. So look, you're not gonna disprove thousands of peer-reviewed documents. So what is the issue? And just try to short circuit this. It's like, okay, and usually it's some combination of, I don't want the government to tell me what to do. It's gonna cost me, or it's gonna cost my job. Some combination of those three things. Well, let's put those on the table and talk about those. So is the Citizens Climate Lobby carbon fee and dividend versus Clean Power Plan? What are the policy, what is the landscape of the policy options? But at least we sort of we get one layer out of the science. When I talk to my friends on the other side of the aisle, I think some of them are looking for how do I do this in a politically safe manner that I don't want to become the next Bob Inglis, I don't want to be a climate martyr. And I don't want to be, clubbed by the other party. And again, I do understand there is a competition. But that's, what is a safe way for a member of the majority to talk about this and not be in jeopardy either in the general election or the primary election? Or is it less risky to say, hey, I'm going to, if not outright deny, say, well, we just don't know, or the science isn't settled, or some kind of thing like that. But that way you avoid taking the stand and you kick it down the road. And I think that's kind of where we are. So I would say it's what is the exit ramp, and Congresswomen and men are far more qualified than me to say what that would be. Stop using science as a proxy, and let's talk about the real issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral, very much. Admiral Phillips, thank you. We mentioned how he talks so much about Hampton Roads, which Congressman Scott has represented for a long time. And it's fascinating that in Northrop Grumman, which is one of those environmental think tanks out in Northern Virginia, if you walk into the lobby, they have a huge chart of the storm surges, the number of storm surges and the height of the storm surge in Norfolk and Portsmouth going back to 1930. And not surprisingly, it's a completely positive slope graph. It gets to by year 2050, basically most of Norfolk, most of Portsmouth is underwater 60% of the year. This is a defense contractor's graph, by the way. So you talked about how hard it is to go to work some days. Tell me about shipbuilding and ship repair at Norfolk and Newport News with this kind of storm surge.
Well, all of those facilities are low, and with the somewhat the exception of Norfolk, Louisiana Shipyard, which is unusual, much of that facility is high, but of course when you go to wide occupancy, it's naturally at water level, so that part of the facility is low. So all of these things are at risk over the long term. And decisions will have to be made about how we adapt them or make them more resilient to what we know is coming. So do we try to roll them in? Do we modify, or they're actually doing some work to modify dry docks now to make them safer, just based on what's happened already? So that is a long-term challenge for the region. The Elizabeth River, where most of the ship repair facilities are located, they're all right at sea level. I mean, they're on obvious nature, right there on the water. So they are all at risk, and the challenge becomes, how do you resolve this issue? Do you move them? Do you start to harden the facilities? Do you start to fill? What's your strategy long term? And I would submit that having that conversation openly is something that has not quite happened yet. These facilities know they have issues. Many of them are starting to take action to their commercial entities to protect their own, to make themselves more resilient. But an open dialogue in the context of the business community in Hampton Roads is only just beginning, even though many of the companies there, especially the larger ones who have long histories in the region, they know this is coming and they're starting to prepare. So there's actually an effort underway right now in the region, Reinvent Hampton Roads, tied to a larger effort of Governor Collis of Virginia. It's looking at economic development within the region, and part of that discussion is starting to pull the business community and talking about sea level rise clusters and sea level rise impacts on other business clusters within the region. So the dialogue has begun, but we still have a long way to go.
Thank you very much. Russ was kind enough to look up how far above sea level the Pentagon is, and it's 56 feet. No one's talking 56 feet sea level rise, but when you think about storm surges up the Potomac, it'll be interesting. But I'd like to recognize Ms. Kanabusa from Hawaii for her question.
Thank you very much. I think this is appropriate. Thank you, Ms. Goodman, for referring to Admiral Locklear. As you know, he was a ACOM commander, so someone that I knew for a period of time that he served in that capacity. But in 2011, Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said this, which is now kind of an interesting prophetic statement. He said, climate change's potential impacts are sobering and far-reaching. Glaciers are melting at a faster rate, causing water supplies to diminish in Asia. Rising sea levels could lead to a mass migration and displacement similar to what we saw in Pakistan's floods last year. And other shifts could reduce the arable land needed to feed a growing population in Africa, for example. Scarcity of water, food, and space could create not only a humanitarian crisis, but create conditions that could lead to failed states, instability, and potentially radicalization. This is exactly what all of you have been saying, and he made that statement on April 28, 2011. The reason I bring it up is today we had a piece of Antarctica float off. This is the size of Delaware, and I'm trying to comprehend how that much of Antarctica could go floating off, or breaking off and floating off, whatever it's doing. So can all of you explain that, is this an occurrence that you all thought would happen? And if yes, then how many more of this magnitude? Delaware, I mean, Hawaii's small. Delaware is small, but it's still not as small. So I'm just trying to conceptualize what we are dealing with, and really the causation, and what we have to do, and can we do anything? Any one of you?
It's science. It's science. Well, thank you, ma'am, for the question. So, as I understand it, and I've been trying to follow some of what's going on with the so-called Larsen seashell. So, just so everybody kind of knows what we're talking about, it is on Antarctica. It's on the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. So this is like the piece of Antarctica that is closest to the bottom of South America. So that's kind of where we're talking about. There are these big ice shelves in many parts of Antarctica. It's very, very different than the Arctic. And as Sherry knows, we get asked, can't you just do the same thing in the Arctic as the Antarctic? And it's different in every way. And one of the ways it's different is you have these massive, sort of like states-wide pieces of floating ice. So the Larsen Shelf is floating. So sea level rise is not increased because that's come up. But they are breaking off, and from what limited observations we have, and the observations down there just aren't really that good. But it does look like big pieces of these shelves are breaking off more and more frequently than they had used to. It's probably because you're getting warmer water, a combination of warmer water and stronger winds. The real issue for things we would care about, you and me, like sea level rise, is sometimes some of these ice shelves are basically, think of the buttress of a Gothic cathedral, and if you take away the buttress, then the whole thing starts coming down. As I understand it, the glacier behind the Larsen Sea ice shelf is not a huge one. So if all of that ice behind this shelf runs out into the ocean, we come up about 2.5 inches. It counts, but this is not going to be feet and feet, and Waikiki doesn't immediately go underwater or something like that. But about 2.5 inches potentially can come. And that's the issue, maybe not so much with this particular shelf, but there are some other places on Antarctica that if the ice shelves go or they start to fracture, this is where we can get much more rapid sea level rise than even the United Nations talked about a few years ago. Whether it's 1 meter, 2 meters, so that's 3 to 5, 7 feet. Those are tremendous, tremendous rises. Considering that in the course of human civilization, you've probably only seen a foot or two of change. So this is what has, I think, everybody in this panel so worried is not only is the climate and sea levels changing, but when it changes rapidly, how do you account for those hundreds of millions of people that live within a few feet of sea level? And it's going to happen globally, all at the same time. We don't get to choose and pick which countries we're going to deal with first and second and third, because it all happens, and it's happening domestically. So my guess is our attention will be focused domestically as well as internationally. So the ice shelf itself, it's interesting. It's probably not a huge impact to us in and of itself, but it's sort of that harbinger, that precursor of massive changes happening, and some of those will have very, very big impacts for our sea level. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Let me just add that, thank you, Mr. Beyer, that your own state of Hawaii, which has a very large concentration of military installations, has been at the forefront of addressing the resilience needed to respond to climate change, both through solar housing, very large solar housing at military facilities in Hawaii, clean energy, which of course economically makes sense in remote areas first, but it's leading the way with solar and other clean energy technologies and microgrids to ensure against other threats. But also looking at the Asia Pacific region, of which Hawaii is right there, and Kwajalein, which is a test facility out in the Pacific region, we have now built an upgrade in a major facility that likely will not be sustainable over its lifetime because of sea level rise, despite even without the Antarctic ice sheet that Dave just talked about. So, we have to be cognizant of the impacts that are already built into the system from climate change that is already part of the world we live in today, and how we're going to make more resilient our communities and our infrastructure.
Thank you very much. Congressman Scott, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you pointed out, I represent the Southeast Virginia area, which includes the Norfolk Naval Base, a lot of other military bases and shipyards. We've been ranked second behind New Orleans as most at risk for sea level rise. And the science, I think, clearly indicates that we have problems. And following up what was just said, we had a summit about a year or two ago And one of the things that came out was that the next foot in sea level rise has been baked in, there's nothing you can do about it. And so you have to figure out what to do, and one strategy was, I think they called it adaptation. When it rains, you get wet, get your computers up to the second floor, and just adapt to it. I'm sure that I would like to see some, maybe not the next foot, but the things we can do to change things.
Well, Congressman, there are things you can do to change things. Interesting that you say about raising the level. I believe a recent political appointee in the Department of the Air Force said that Hagelin Air Force Base would just have to build things up on stilts. Any future military construction was going to have to take into account flooding. But long term, of course, as I mentioned at the end of my opening remarks, we're going to have to adapt, but long term you've got to mitigate. And of course, what's causing all this is CO2. And the number one consumer of fossil fuels in this country and perhaps the world is the Department of Defense. I mean, they burn fossil fuels at an incredible rate. But they are making great strides in getting themselves weaned off of the fossil fuels. As then General Mattis said he needed to get off this tether of fossil fuels when he was in Iraq. It was driving him crazy. So alternative fuels, which great progress has been made towards that somewhat in DOD in the last 3 or 4 years, are getting there. And when I was a base commander at Parris Island, when the electricity went out, we had an oil-fired power plant. It was horrible, just horrible. Now it's starting to convert to solar. As Sherry mentioned, a number of the bases here, the DOD's got a program called Net Zero, where the bases and stations will produce more power than they consume, and it's well underway at all bases and stations. So, but those programs, I think, are a little bit in jeopardy when we look at the DOD budget. I'm not sure where now Secretary Mattis stands on those, although he's admitted that he understands climate change.
If we do all that we can do, what difference would it make?
Oh, it's going to be, that's a great question, because I think that's the defeatist attitude. And I was pulling out the JCPOA, or I'm sorry, the Paris Accord was a huge mistake. That us backing out of our commitments to help reduce CO2 contribution is terrible. I mean, it's just a big mistake. So I mean, we've got to stop our CO2 emissions, and alternative fuels are one of the answers.
In addition, we are developing the tools to build more resilient communities, and the House Climate Solutions Caucus is a great focal point to sort of support and develop that and have a bipartisan approach. But as an example, in your district, when Norfolk has to raise the pier, it should account not just for the sea level rise as already occurred, but for projected sea level rise for the duration of that piece of infrastructure. So we need to build in those planning factors throughout our infrastructure, whatever infrastructure initiatives we undertake for the military and the civilian community now, they need to consider flooding and sea level rise and other planning factors that will be affected by climate change so that they're resilient and can make our societies more durable. There's green infrastructure approaches as well. We need to think about the natural infrastructure, the coastal communities in particular. There are great opportunities better to preserve the natural infrastructure to make it more resilient, and some of that has been demonstrated well in the response to Hurricane Superstorm Sandy in the New York, New Jersey region, where they've rebuilt the coastal areas in ways that are more naturally resilient to future storm events.
Thank you very much. We have a question from the audience, actually from Bethany Allen at Foreign Policy Magazine. And your boss, the publisher, David Rothrock, had a great op-ed today, by the way. So for Dr. King, Pentagon has traditionally been outside partisan debates over climate change. Has that changed with this administration? Is the Department of Defense still able to marshal the abundance of resources, the amount of resources needed for climate change preparations as previous administrations? And Dr. King, if at some point you want to kick it to a different person, but since you're working out of DC, sort of.
Well, I think the real answer is we're not sure yet. But there are parts of the issues that that can be addressed, and so one thing I would say is it's all about the water in terms of instability around the world, and so water is something that is very visceral. It's very noticeable. It's causing famines that can easily be detected. So I think that response for famine relief, increased humanitarian assistance and operations are all things that will continue to gather support. And so I believe that partnerships between the private sector and the Pentagon and the science agencies, can all coalesce around water as an issue. And so I think that's a good place to start, and it's something that has momentum right now.
And you can do that with this administration as well as on earlier administrations. So you're still optimistic that that can move forward?
Yes, I am.
We need more optimism. Ms. Bernice, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ranking Member Johnson and Vice Ranking Member Beyer, for holding this important discussion today. Thank you, each of you, for being here. It's unfortunate that we aren't having this discussion in the full committee. Is not and should not be a partisan issue. This alarm has been raised here in Congress since back in the 80s. I mean, we continue to have this conversation and how important it is. My home state of Oregon and our state legislature has made significant progress. We have a renewable fuel standard, our last coal-fired plants being phased out, great support for renewables, but we still have a lot of work to do. And of course, on a national basis, we need to be looking at states like Oregon, where we understand that we can build the economy and reduce carbon emissions at the same time. It's really important. General Cheney, you mentioned the reduction of fossil fuels in the Department of Defense. I just, a couple days ago, had a conversation with the manufacturer of an electric aircraft tractor for moving aircraft around the tarmac. They sell their electric vehicle to the private sector all around the world, to other militaries, but not U.S. And they've been trying for years and years and years. I think breaking through the Department of Defense and something like that is a real challenge. I wanted to, we know the list of issues and challenges, and they've been discussed. Sea level rise, I represent a coastal district. Extreme weather events, we see the effect of those. I am the co-chair of the Oceans Caucus, and I'm very concerned about ocean health and ocean acidification. And as we look at what happens with ocean acidification and the percentage of the world's food supply that comes from the ocean, I wonder if someone would be willing to talk a little bit about what that sort of instability would do, that losing or reduction of a food source, what does that do to global instability? And then also on a somewhat related issue, I know there was a mention of the Paris withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, but I know Ms. Goodman, you have some experience with that. Can you expand on that a little bit? So the insecurity that comes from a reduction of a global food source, but also can you talk about the national security implications of the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and what that says about the U.S. and its leadership?
Thank you, Congresswoman, and let me commend you for the recent award you received during Capitol Hill Oceans Week from the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation. I had the privilege of being there for that event and hearing your excellent remarks, very well deserved. And as a member of the Joint Ocean Commission initiative, we focus deeply on ocean acidification among other matters about protecting ocean health and protecting ocean communities. And, ocean acidification is a very deeply concerning phenomenon that is threatening global food supply. It's being exacerbated by the fact that the populations are expanding, particularly in Asia. So, fish is becoming an even more important source of protein across, particularly the Asia Pacific and other coastal areas. Many areas are already suffering from overfishing, which is also exacerbated by ocean acidification. And as you know, in your coastal area and on up the coast, through Washington State, affected key sources of food supply. The shellfish industry has been very hard hit, and that needs to be, that needs to be addressed, and we need to be mindful of how food insecurity is going to exacerbate these other instabilities in coming years. And that affects not only coastal areas, but it affects growing regions and heartland agricultural areas as well. As to the withdrawal from the Paris Accords, personally, I'm deeply concerned at the absence of U.S. leadership in key global forum is detrimental to American leadership globally, because this is so important to so many around, so many nations, so many allies around the globe, and that the U.S. Will increasingly be sidelined in major global forums, and we will not be able to command and be able to lead by example in the area. And then we'll also begin to lose technological and competitive edge as a result of not continuing to stay on the fast track on the innovation curve, not being looked to for our innovation. And, as you noted, even some of the technological developments that you've observed in your own district are not being taken up, partly because procurement is acquisition is very difficult and cumbersome in our own Department of Defense, but perhaps because there's not as much incentive as there is to bring it along as there are in other countries. And so I'm deeply concerned that we will no longer give to our children, the era of innovation and prosperity that we all, our generation, has all been privileged to come of age and prospering, and that we're not creating that for our future by not attending to these issues.
Thank you, and I don't want to speak for all my colleagues, but I'm pretty comfortable in saying that we share your concerns about that lack of leadership.
Can I just make a follow-on comment here? The American Security Project a couple of years ago did a study. It was very simple. We went to all the countries in the world, went to their embassies here and said, how many of you have written climate change into your equivalent national security strategy? And 70% of them had. Almost all of them were developed countries. Certainly China and Russia were among them. The 30% that hadn't mostly were underdeveloped or didn't even have a military. So my point being that everyone had written it into the national security strategy. I'm a member of a group called the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change. It takes a couple of flag officers from a large number of countries around the world to address climate change issues. And after the pullout of the Paris Accord, they all looked at me and said, who's leading the show here? It's obviously not you. Whereas in the past, when we sat down at the table, we had a pretty good voice in the matters, and now they're just not so sure. And it's very disheartening to me. So.
Just very quickly, I'm sure we're short on time here. Just about a place where the ocean acidification links into strategy. As I'm sure everybody here knows, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which we, along with Syria, North Korea, Iran, and Iraq, have not ceded to, but most have. If that gives a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone to basically every country. And for a lot of small countries, small island countries, that is their economic lifeline, what lives in there. As the oceans warm and acidify, if the fish and the critters that they were using to support themselves and their economy move out, it's not too hard to see, let's say, some other rising country come around and say, this UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, written by American lawyers to lock in U.S. maritime advantage, isn't working so well for them. Why don't we renegotiate? We're not even in the treaty. So if we're not careful, one of the components of climate change and acidification could be used to try to nullify what had been a very advantageous treaty for United States global maritime interests. I'm not saying that is happening, but it could happen. It's pretty easy to see how that could happen. If I can think of it, there's probably 1 million people in another country that can think of that. Regarding Paris, there may be a non-intuitive effect, and that is, I understand that more people in the United States have Googled climate and climate change since President Trump has left. The interest is never being higher. We are finally surpassing levels of interest and concern beyond ClimateGate, where we kind of peaked and then came down. So although I doubt if this was the president's intent, but he may have started grassroots efforts that he never intended, one that will actually help on the CO2 reduction. But we might be able to get this into real momentum here. But I absolutely agree with Sherry and with General Cheney on the threats to U.S. leadership. That's very concerning. Thanks.
Thank you.
It doesn't seem to be the first grassroots effort that the president's doing. Mr. Tonka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank Chair Johnson and our colleague, Congressman Beyer, for organizing this great discussion, this roundtable discussion on what is a very timely topic, one that I think has grown into a global issue. And thank you for our panelists for being here. First, just an observation and a thank you, because in recent years, I think it's very much recognized that the most sane and most strong voices out there speaking to some of the very concerns and threats of climate change have come from our Defense Department, our State Department, and our intelligence community. And for that I say thank you, because it's drawn, you provide a credible voice, and it's drawn a particular bit of interest. So we thank you for that. And undeniably, the impacts, deep impacts onto the Defense Department to fulfill their mission has become very much more complicated because of climate change. So thank you very much. Can any of our guests, would any of our guests please discuss what it means when the Defense Department or our intelligence community calls climate change a threat multiplier?
That's your fault. Yeah.
That's the mother of that term. I guess I'll take that one. So, we framed that, the CNA Military Advisory Board in 2007 used that term in its first report to characterize the threat of climate change as one that magnifies other existing risks that we face from instability, both in fragile and now we see even in stable regions of the world. So where you have political conflict, threats of terrorism, nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction, climate factors, natural resource factors, from drought to flooding to extreme weather events, as was very vividly told in the narrative by Ambassador Campbell about Nigeria. These climate change acts to exacerbate the underlying tensions and can serve as the tipping point to instability in key regions.
Thank you. And so with that, do you believe that these are the types of examples of secondary and tertiary effects of climate change that qualify as threat multipliers? You know, these given issues out there of refugees and just the concerns for a refugee population that currently could grow tremendously and then impact the international scene in that regard.
Well, the fact that we now live in an era where we have the largest number of refugees that we've seen, larger number perhaps even than during after World War II, for a variety of reasons, is in part exacerbated by climate factors as people migrate, particularly from Africa and from parts of Central America, looking for more economic opportunity or fleeing unsafe conditions because they can no longer provide food, shelter, and water for their families where they've lived. So yes, I believe that climate change is acting as a threat multiplier to lead to a whole wave of climate refugees that we are now experiencing and that will continue to grow in future years with sea level rise, extreme weather events, and increased droughts and floods.
And in terms of the economic consequences of pulling out of the Accord, there are those who are suggesting that because we won't be part of that epicenter of discussion and dialogue, that we can be harmed by that. Any thoughts on that in regard to us serving in an international setting that puts us at any particular disadvantage? What would be the primary disadvantages of not being at that table, having pulled ourselves out of the global table setting for climate discussion?
Well, I'm deeply concerned that, we're becoming somewhat of a pariah in global international circles. And that has both a political impact, but it also, very importantly, has economic impact on our own nation for the ability to engage, to export our own innovations, and gain competitive advantage in the growing global economy of clean energy and future advanced energy infrastructure. I mean, this is the wave of the future. The whole energy system is in transition now. Of course, we will still use fossil fuels for many more years, but we are building in and developing a whole new generation of energy and of energy infrastructure that's not based on fossil fuels. And we should be the leaders of that technology and that opportunity for our own job security and for our own nation's economic security. And if we're not incentivized at the local level, I mean, some states are. A lot of the leadership is at the local level in California and other states. But if we're not nationally incentivized to undertake those efforts, I fear that we will fall behind.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan, very much. But we've been joined by two more wonderful members of Congress. Congressman Bill Foster, who's on the Science Committee, who is proudly the only PhD scientist in this country. And Congressman Ryan Costello from Pennsylvania, who is one of the leaders of our Climate Solutions Focus. Ryan, I want to particularly thank you for coming. We've been limiting it to one question each just to go around more and more. So, Bill, the floor is yours.
I think that's actually toughens it up a lot. Maybe I'll bring up just one issue, which is if we look at the long-term stance that will be, when you look at our armed forces with respect to fuel supplies. You have nuclear, and you also have, if we want to transition to a sustainable situation, of biofuels. And so one of the things that we're risking is when we just cut back on all the green energy initiatives is not going there. It's hard to write down scenarios, for example, for airplanes that really don't rely on burning hydrocarbons. At this point, it's technologically really tough. And the only renewable sources of those are going to be biofuels, in all probability. And so we're foregoing that. And there have been, I think under the Obama administration, even I think under the Bush administration, some experiments along those lines to actually make prototype biofuels and actually use them in operational military aircraft. And I was wondering, what is the time scale on which you think we're giving up the lead in biofuels, and what are the implications of that?
As Congressman, as you probably know, virtually every aircraft we've got in the inventory had flown on some form of biofuels. All our jet fighter aircraft had been on biofuels. And the wrap on biofuels was that a gallon of biofuels cost 10, 20 times a gallon of normal fossil fuel. But those prices are coming down dramatically. I mean, just dramatically, and maybe within a couple of years they might be equivalent in price to normal gasoline. We're losing that technological edge for sure. And other countries, i.e. China and Russia, are going to overlap us and overtake us in that research. And it's failing. I mean, it's just a failing that we've got, and a big mistake.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, John. Mr. Costello?
Well, I'm concerned, I'm a little late. Is there a particular subject matter we're pursuing, or
what we're doing, the national security part of climate change. But it is climate change writ large, but we have flag officers and professors and ambassadors.
Well, I mean, in reading materials, one, from a preventive measures perspective, if I could ask the question, let's talk about the estimated cost here of rating, what, from your perspective, the things that we should be doing. Can you share what military policies or readiness type issues we should be pursuing, and can you quantify what you think those costs would be? Very broad-based question, but I'm just curious what some of you may have to say about that.
I'll just give you one quick answer because it's one of my pet peeves. The vice president said a year or so ago, the current vice president, that the war on coal is over. And he's right. It's over, of course, because the economics of wind and solar and renewables are becoming far more cheaper than burning coal is. And when you look at the sources of power in the Midwest, Texas, California, you see the expansion of solar power and wind power. The economics are going to drive this, where coal is just going to go out of business because it's not affordable. It's too expensive. On the DoD side of the house, the using of alternative fuels, and I mentioned earlier my own experience at Paris Island and all the bases and stations that we've been to now that are becoming solar powered, where the base commander doesn't have to rely on the local grid anymore. He's got his own source of power. So it's an independence for the base commander, plus that it's a money saver. I mean, long term, it's going to save a ton of money. And I think they do understand that at DoD, although the funding to do that is not necessarily there, nor the research that they've got, but it's getting there. And net zero programs in all the departments for the bases and stations are working. And eventually they will produce more power than they will consume.
Thank you, Ryan. We cycle back now to the chair of our committee, or the ranking member of the Science Space Committee, Ms. Johnson.
I'd like to see if there are questions from the audience.
Well, we do have a couple up here. Let me do one that jumps right out. At last month's panel meeting, Dr. Goldstein mentioned the problems of climate change and health. So the question is, how is the military supporting the adaptation of troops in extreme weather, heat waves, etc., so to protect them and protect the health of our troops? Admiral Phillips?
Not an expert on health of troops other than the troops that work for me, which is of course by necessity. We do and we are thinking more about infrastructure and personal protective gear that we should improve to allow our troops to better operate either under extreme heat or extreme cold conditions. We've learned quite a few lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan under both circumstances, heat and cold, for troops in the field. But we also have challenges, and Ms. Goodman has talked extensively about the Arctic, in operating in that world, not only with personal protective equipment, but also with the kinds of things that will need to be adapted on our ships, on our aircraft, so that they can also operate in that environment with relative immunity, and be prepared for the kinds of temperatures that they will have to deal with. An example is, boat crews. In my experience, working in the Baltic Sea or working in the northern Scottish Op areas, the water temperature there is quite cold. Typically, we wouldn't put a boat in the water unless the water temperature was above 50 degrees. In our case, because we don't have the right protective gear routinely applied for surface ships for that kind of circumstance, the European navies will look at us aghast. So we are learning that we have to prepare more thoroughly for those kinds of circumstances and get our troops ready to go, and our sailors and soldiers and airmen and Marines, so that actually our air community is ready in that circumstance. But more broadly to apply and understand the kinds of things that our armed forces has to deal with, and also to understand the kinds of conditions and training required for physical performance under those circumstances. There's also been quite a bit of work done on that. Again, driven by circumstances most recently in Iraq and Afghanistan, but will be driven in the future by the ability to operate in the Arctic, which is coming.
If I could make two observations on that quickly. When I, as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, I oversaw the Armed Forces Pest Management Board. And that is a group of military officers who are trained as epidemiologists and prepare our forces for the disease vectors they will face when they deploy. And in recent years, what has happened is that the disease vectors have migrated further north with higher temperatures. And so we have to prepare our troops to face a range of diseases that they previously did not have to address. Second, in the Arctic, as we prepare now to operate in that region in a surface capacity, we found that first of all, we don't have icebreakers. That's one. That's not a health issue, but it is one that we are sorely lacking in capacity for icebreaking capability. But also, as our Air Force and our Army prepare to have to operate in that region, they found that their older gear, as we go back into Iceland, as we prepare to go, into Greenland, we don't have the cold regions gear that we need to protect our troops in that region.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Member Johnson.
Thank you very much. This week, we're going to be debating kind of a water supply area of concern in northern and southern California. And I'm from Texas, where we have adding tonight in lawsuit with Oklahoma on water. But Dr. King, you focused a lot of your studies on the impact of climate change on natural resources, such as making access to water in certain regions more difficult and exacerbating both internal and cross-border tensions. Can you give us some of the results of your studies? Are we looking forward to more of this? Are we about to get over it? Is Northern and Southern California going to come together?
Well, as a professor of international affairs, my ambit sort of begins at the U.S. borders and then radiates outward. But I do have some analogies I can draw, I believe. In terms of water scarcity in other countries, I find that the threat multiplier in this case can be population movements, population growth. It could be ethnic tensions, but it could also be poor governance. And so I don't think we have poor governance in the United States. I think that the cognizant authorities, for example, in California, are very aware of the problems, and they're seeking innovative solutions to these problems. And one thing that's great also compared to the case studies I've seen is just the institutional capacity within the United States to study these problems and to address them. So there's not much of an analogy there. But I do believe things are bifurcated. For example, in California, there's a lot of small municipal water districts that need to come together and get on the same page. And some of the really local problems need to be addressed at higher levels, at the state and federal level, in order to reach these solutions. But I'm confident that the analogies in the fragile states that I've looked at won't bear themselves out in the American West for those reasons.
I live in the state that's called Texas. And one end of our state has quite a bit of water called the Gulf of Mexico. But where I live, we're inland, so we build our water supply pretty much. But we're also closer to Oklahoma than we are to the other end. How will global warming cause us to re-look at how we plan for that type of supply?
Do you want to, or I can? So Congresswoman, I mean, as you probably know from many very distinguished scientists testifying before your committee, getting the rainfall right in these projections of these future climate models is still pretty hard, and we certainly appreciate the support of continuing funding the agencies that work on this. But in a big picture, what we see is that in general, south of 40 degrees north, so kind of think of the Mason-Dixon line, will probably dry out. North will probably stay as wet or get wetter. But pretty much every place, we will see this, what sounds like almost this paradox of both increasing droughts and, when it rains, increasing floods. Because when it rains, the rain's going to come down harder, and you get these flash floods like we saw in Houston, Baton Rouge, the Carolina, you just named it, Ellicott City, Maryland, this last year. But when, as we heat up, and we're very, very confident that we're heating up, we know we're heating up, it tends to dry everything out, and drought begets drought, so you get more of these. So I would think, I mean, I am not an expert in water, let alone in Texas and Oklahoma, but people are gonna have to think about not only how do you store it, but how do you use it more efficiently, how do you recycle more efficiently, when it rains, making sure that storm sewers and various catchments and stuff are designed for much more intense rainfalls than we've seen. Because at some point, it's not going to be acceptable to the local population to say, oh, it was a 1 in 500 year rainfall, how could we have known? Because it's like, you should know. So I think that's what's going to happen. So in your area of the state, in general, probably less and more sporadic, but when it rains, it'll be harder. So we're just going to have to be smarter, all of us, on how we use that water.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. Can you discuss what kind of capabilities the Department of Defense or DHS might need to acquire in order to protect our new interest in the Arctic in light of the possibility of year-round ice reshipping? And Ms. Goodman mentioned briefly icebreakers, but are there other things that we need to be considering from a DoD perspective? And perhaps Admiral Phillips as a ship driver, or General Cheney as somebody who storms the beach.
Sherry Goodman and I both came off 2 big task force on the Arctic in this last year. One study was done by the International Security Advisory Board, which we finished in September and published a report, which you can go online and get. And then we just finished one at the Council on Foreign Relations here about 2 months ago on the Arctic with Admiral Thad Allen and Christine Todd Whitman as the co-chairs, which had a number of recommendations in there. And the focus on the one, my part of it was with the ISAB one, was the security perspective. And there's been a lot of hype and talk about what the Russians are doing in the Arctic, the number of bases they're building, the amount of money they're pouring into it. But I'll give you my bottom line to this. One, they're not up to the level that they were at the height of the Cold War. They haven't even rebuilt those facilities enough. Secondly, they view the Northern Sea Route, one, as somewhat of a threat to perhaps Murmansk, which is its strategic base, and also a source of economy, where they're going to tax ships that eventually get through the Northern Sea Route. So some would say, well, we better build up our defenses, and I categorically deny that. I just don't see the threat to the United States that Russia poses in the Arctic, or certainly what they've got. Russia has, I think, 50% of the coastline of the Arctic is Russian. And we're 10 to 15%, if I remember right. In turn, we talk icebreakers. Sherry and I did a nice interview with the Assistant Commandant of the Coast Guard here about a year ago, and he said, counterintuitively, the melting of the Arctic ice cap means you need more icebreakers, not less. And the reason for that is, of course, you got more icebergs that are floating around, and as the shipping increases, you got to protect those ships, which is the reason you need more icebreakers. Congress has somewhat got this message and is starting to fund for at least 1 and maybe 2. The Coast Guard Commandant will tell you you need 6 icebreakers. So we're a long ways to go. I can tell you in terms of positioning of forces, I don't think it's a national security threat what Russia's doing up there. We just need to be prepared to take care of our own country, take care of our own resources.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Sherry, did you have anything to add?
Sure, thank you. 2 points we have there about the Arctic. We have many communities that are in the Arctic and in Alaska now that are increasingly at risk because the permafrost is thawing. The ice is no longer there in the communities as long, so the subsistence lifestyles of many Alaskan villages is now threatened because of changes in the Arctic climate, to the point where provision is being made to relocate a number of communities now because they will not be viable into the future to support them. Second, the economic opportunities and therefore the risks are growing very rapidly in the region. There's energy, there are minerals, there's opportunities to transit and navigate. I mean, should the Northern Sea Route become like a toll road across Russia, or eventually the polar route across the Arctic eventually open at some point in future years, those will be faster transit routes than through Asia and around and around that region for certain shipping from Asia to Europe. So it's possible in the future that Iceland becomes the next Singapore. So why are countries like Singapore and Korea very interested in the Arctic? Because they see that economic opportunity coming. And with that, we need to understand both what that means and also the risks attended to it in future years with tourism, possibilities of oil spills or accidents leading to search and rescue needs, and we don't have a Coast Guard capability prepared to operate in that region on short notice at the present time.
Thank you very much.
And I would add, Congressman Beyer, that from the surface Navy's perspective, it ties exactly into what Ms. Goodman has just said. In Task Force Climate Change, one of the things that the surface community did, and Admiral Toby's request at the time, was to study whether or not our surface combatants, were there things that we would need to change to operate more frequently, more commonly in the Arctic. And I mean basic construction things like, do we have to change hydraulic fluids? Do we have to change, do we have brittle failure of metals, and do we need to change some of our construction practices? And we found that, in fact, yes, we did. That most of our ships are not built to operate for extended periods of time under those sorts of conditions. So if we're going to see more and more opportunities to operate in that region, then we're going to have to think about how do we prepare and harden and make ready our surface forces and other parts of our armed force to operate in that circumstance. The risks will be greater. We know that charting in that region is not good and needs to be updated. In fact, in many cases, needs to be charted. It's been covered with ice before. That not to make too fine a point on it, but that's all true. So that all will cost money, and that all will need to be done in advance. And there is great risk to operating in that region because of the extreme weather conditions. We just don't operate there enough to be highly skilled Arctic operators. And if we are going to see more and more open water or ice passages that will get more commercial ships up there and get more other interests up there, then it will be in our national security interest to be able to operate there, and we're going to have to make changes to be able to do it.
Very good, thank you. We've been joined by a member of Congressman from the Ocean State, Rhode Island, Congressman Jim Lanzo. Jim, we've been doing one question each to try to keep things moving. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Don. I appreciate that. I want to thank you for organizing this panel. I welcome and thank our very distinguished panel of participants for being here. Thank you all for your service to the country in various ways. So just a brief comment. We often talk about the effects of climate change from an environmental or economic perspective, and we don't often talk about it from a national security perspective. So this year, I serve as a senior member of the House Armed Services Committee, and I introduced an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, which was adopted in committee, that recognized that climate change is a national security issue and challenge that we need to deal with. Consistent with what Secretary Madison said, what the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Jim Dunford, has said, as well as other admirals and generals who are in and out of government service currently have said. And basically, my amendment would require that we take some initial steps to assess the challenges and how we make it. It would require a report from the Pentagon to identify the top 10 military installations in each of the services that are most affected by climate change. Each of the services, steps that we can take to mitigate those challenges, as well as try to get our hands around the costs associated with those challenges. It would also require our commanders
to assess how it affects the strategic battle plans over the next 20 years. And so, again, I was pleased that the amendment was adopted. Unfortunately, the amendment has been under attack, and there is a plan to try to repeal that language. That is the amendment being proposed to use. I'm hoping that doesn't make it through the rules committee, but it may very well. So those are the comments that I wanted to add to the discussion here today. And you all appreciate it. Are we doing questions right now? Or
If you have one, please.
Just, I don't know if these types of things have come up yet, but so in your research, can you talk about the best methodologies to understand the divergent costs of and impacts of climate change on that's number one. In addition to that, how might you best convey the cost to the public? It's very difficult sometimes for people to be 20 and 30 years out. If you look at the time frames when it comes to the military plan, although we do that all the time on the Hill, but your professional experience will be the best way to convey that to the public. So great way to start.
Well, Congressman, thank you for your amendment. We've all read it. I think all of our opening statements had a little line in there thanking your committee and hoping that it got passed, and we hope it survives today because it gave a little breath of fresh air to the environment that's going on around here, and we really appreciate your amendment. In terms of cost, I've talked earlier about tactical and strategic implications of climate change and national security. Catastrophic weather events like Sandy or Haiyan were joint ventures where all the services were involved. They had to pay for those. Admiral Locklear mentioned that climate change was his #1 threat in the Pacific Command. He was clearly looking at one of those reasons was he had to budget for climate change. He had to budget for catastrophic response. It's not free. That money's coming from somewhere. It's coming from you, and you can put a price tag on that. You can say here's how much we anticipate that we might have to spend in catastrophic response. And on the adaptation side, we've talked at length here somewhat about bases and stations impacted. You're either going to have to move bases or move buildings higher, or build piers higher. There's going to be tremendous expense involved, near term and long term, and the DoD, I think, can be asked to propose what they think that cost is going to be.
Congressman, I had the privilege 2 years ago of traveling with you on the congressional delegation to the Munich Security Conference. And you and I were among the few, along with Senator Whitehouse and others, who were putting climate security on that agenda. And I want to thank you for your leadership here on this amendment. I think it's very important. It's recognized and been widely read throughout the community, the national security community who attends to this. I think it will have a beneficial impact. And I'd say, some of the you asked about methodologies that are important better to understand this. In your own state, you've got the Naval War College, which with others like it is expert in wargaming and simulation. And the military routinely uses war games and it doesn't have to be about a war, but about a conflict or an incident, a tension, an instability that's going to arise. And scenario planning is very useful. And we need to do more of that in this area to understand how the world is unfolding from the Arctic to South Asia, and understand those risks and have real people play roles, so they have to respond to real events. We're beginning to do more of this, but there's a lot more that could be done utilizing capabilities resident throughout the defense and intelligence communities to fully understand them.
Thank you very much.
I want to thank you, Chairman Beyer, and Representative Johnson for hosting this panel I'll close by just saying that both have chance to speak with my senior Senator Jack Reed, Reverend Senator Andres, as well as Senator Whitehouse, the fight to the Roundtable Conference for being colleagues on the Republican side, the friends, that both through the original language of the amendment, there is a
team. We're all very proud of what you've been able to accomplish, and we'll fight hard to make sure it doesn't get stripped. It'll be a nice balance to pulling out of Paris. Ambassador Campbell, you, I just finished this amazing book called Civil Wars by David Armitage that talks about how now all wars are civil wars, essentially since 1945. That they talk about a global civil war, and that it's all essentially fights over resources. And you've linked climate change to Islamic extremism.
I have,
Boko
yes.
Haram, what happened in Syria. And the irony that sometimes politically in America, the people most concerned about Islamic extremism are the ones least warm to the idea of fighting climate change. Is there a way of effectively making that link in our culture, in our society, in our political thinking?
Yes, I think there is. It involves an educational process, and an educational process that talks about the links in concrete terms, not in abstract terms, that shows that there is a direct relationship between desertification and drought, and the preparation of a population for radicalization, which is exactly the phenomena that we saw in northeastern Nigeria, and one of my colleagues made the same point about Mali. The more you can talk about it specifically, the better. A problem with talking about climate change and radicalization is so long as we keep it in the abstract, it becomes very difficult to actually understand and relate to.
Thank you very much. Ms. Esty, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to follow up a little bit related to some of those issues. A lot of you have talked about the impact on climate refugees. A number of us took a trip to India earlier this year, and the challenges around clean water, challenges around energy consumption are considerable. But I would argue as well, those are huge opportunities for the United States if we get our climate policies in line with actually world needs as well. So several of you have referenced the cost of not taking these steps. You know, if you're like the frog that gets boiled over time because you don't realize it. Are there systematic attempts within the defense community to try to calculate, and I know that our colleague, Mr. Landyman, his amendment is designed to, in fact, try to force that kind of calculation, that kind of planning, but what would that look like? What should we be asking for in terms of research budgets or otherwise to calculate the cost of what is clearly, something is happening that just you, frankly, is it human caused or not? Many of our colleagues would say it's not caused by humans, this is natural variation. Well, if it's natural variation, you still have to deal with it. Right? We're still going to be seeing flooding, we're still going to see changes in waterfall, you're still going to see more extreme weather events. Is there a way to try to model this and look at the costs, regardless of the cost of mitigation, action, and cost of
I'll start with that, thanks, and I'm sure others will join in. I mean, the DoD can actually estimate costs. You can argue how well they do it, but they can in fact estimate costs. Admiral Phillips was talking about some of the surface ship operations in high latitude areas. We did that. The Navy did that in about 2010, I think, and then we didn't do it. And the reason we didn't do it, and we haven't done it, is because of the cost. It's expensive. It's probably arguably. I was told as a junior 1-star by a 3-star officer, congratulations, Jerry, you are responsible for the most expensive port visit the U.S. Atlantic Fleet has ever conducted. And it's expensive to work out there. So then sequestration came, and then we just stopped doing it, and we haven't started. The part I would say that this committee could be a direct help with the Armed Services Committees on this is that if the DoD was told to plan to something, the first thing they're going to come back to somebody in the Congress and say, plan to what exactly? And that then brings up, and I hate to even say these two words to here, but it brings up the climate services idea. I know that was attempted in 2011 and it did not go well. But at some point, we're going to need some sort of common authoritative baseline to which to plan. So are we going to plan for 1 meter of sea level rise by 2100, 2 meters, or a half meter? And it does vary by installation. But I can go into the scientific literature and I can almost find the number you want me to find. But what is going to be like we have a hurricane center? You may or may not agree with that hurricane forecast, but my God, that's what we use, and that's what we plan to, that's what we manage to. We do not have that same type of fidelity in the climate world right now. I was asked by a professional staffer just a few weeks ago, please tell me the official authoritative projections for sea level in the Norfolk area by decade. Understand there's going to be a plus or minus, just give me the numbers. You can't actually find those. You can find a number of research papers with different people, different things, but there's no sort of, okay, what should the planning document be? So again, it would be up to you if we need to rename it because climate services is a bad name, fine, call it extreme prevention, weather recurrence, something, I don't care. But somehow we're going to need to figure out a way to give not only the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, really everybody should at least states, agencies, because right now everybody's going after their favorite consultant or contractor, they're shopping. It's a guild mentality. This is how we would do it in the 1400s. We go off, we have a guild, you ask a question, 5 months later you get a report back. It may or may not have answered, somebody made a bunch of money on it. But that's how we're doing it today. And it's for those who in the Pentagon who do want to address this issue, seriously, I get this issue all the time. It's like, Tiddly, why can't we have, tell me what the numbers are and tell me that this is what the US government, like the Hurricane Center, would stand by. And we're not there. Then we can plug them into scenarios, into war games, into all the kind of cost models that the Pentagon has, and you can start projecting ranges. They're going to be with bees. It's going to be expensive. But right now, the fact that we don't have authoritative data which everybody can say, yes, I can use this and I'm good to use, is a challenge.
Although to some extent, there's a chicken and egg problem where this is the scale of a global scale of this is not going to have authoritative numbers. And my concern is in part that becomes an excuse, and I will say with many of my colleagues, it becomes an excuse to take no action. Say, we're just going to study some more. And in 20 years, we'll have better numbers. Well, by then, we're not taking action. So I think we need to sort of marry this somehow to, or arrange that we agree with.
You could have authoritative numbers. I would go back, look at the hurricane forecasts of 30 years ago. They were not very good compared to today, but they were authoritative. So
we picked them.
So we can, I really do think the science is to the point where you can have authoritative data, and as science advances, fine, the confidence interval comes down, but there's no reason in God's green earth today why you can't have authoritative data.
And I would just echo Congressman Esty, based on the pilot project that I was a part of in Hampton Roads, that was our #1 recommendation: set standards, set regional standards. They will be different for different locations. That adds to the challenge. And one argument is, well, what happens if you set that? What if you're wrong? Well, you can change it. You can adapt it over time. You see what the science is telling you, and you look at it every 5 years or 10 years or 3 years, whatever you need to, and you make a change. But one of the challenges we have in our region is all the cities they're not planning to, they don't even use the same vertical data. They're not planning to the same sea level rise scenario. They use a contractor that gives them an answer they want. And so we have all these people jammed in together with all these federal entities, and they're all doing something different. So standards absolutely are critical to getting everybody on a common framework, and then from there, developing a master plan, monitoring your data, and figuring out how you're going to go forward, and figure out the cost. Because if you don't have a standard to plan to, you're never going to get it to a cost that's worth anything.
You guys just did a tremendous job of describing the scientific process.
Without a red team.
We're getting off the coast of 5:30, so we have to wrap it up with a final question from our distinguished scientist, Congressman Dr. Foster.
Okay, well, when I try to come up with any sort of positive effect here, the only thing I was able to come up with was the idea that for example, China is busy building these islands, presumably just barely above sea level in the South China Sea. And so at some point, they become a large issue. It's my understanding that actually we've had trouble with these islands collapsing just due to normal typhoons. And when typhoons get worse, that alone will cause them to grieve. And not to mention, does anyone have, well, the serious part of this question is, has someone systematically gone through and looked at a differential way, both at ourselves and our potential adversaries, and looked at the potential refugee loads that those economies have to deal with? Presumably, the big flow of refugees, people point to places like Bangladesh, and most of those won't land in North America, is my presumption, but they cause a lot of trouble elsewhere. Similarly, if you just look at the whole set of naval facilities, different things like dry docks, submarine facilities, and so on, presumably we get in trouble in different ways depending on their design. And has there been a systematic survey of both ours and our adversaries?
Congressman, it's very simple. The answer is no, sir. We recommended that in Task Force Climate Change, and this is back in 2010, 7 years ago. It has not happened. And you can ask the Department of Defense as to why that is, but the fact is they have not done that.
Interesting, one-word answer.
Well, I still have another hour of questions, but we promised we'd end at 5:30. And I know this was as long as Mr. Comey's testimony before Senate Intelligence, and not as long as Hillary Clinton's was in the housing hearing. But thank you for your patience, for your energy, for your incredible clarity, for giving us a great deal of information, great attendance. Hopefully this will be the continuing base upon which we build a stronger military and a more thoughtful reaction to the impact climate change will have on all of us. So thank you all very much, and we stand adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Two.